My name is Ibrahim Traoré. I serve as the president of Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation in West Africa where the red dust of the Sahel meets the quiet faith of millions of ordinary people. I was born far from the grand halls where world leaders gather. I grew up among people who worked with their hands, prayed before they ate, and believed that a leader is not someone above the people but someone chosen to carry their burdens. Over the years, my role has taken me into rooms I never imagined entering when I was young. I have sat across tables from presidents, ministers, generals, and diplomats from many parts of the world. I have listened to their ideas, their strategies, and their explanations of how they believe power should be used. Those meetings taught me something unexpected, not just about politics, but about the very nature of leadership. The difference between leaders does not always appear in their policies or speeches. Sometimes it appears in the quiet moments before the meeting begins, when a leader chooses what truly guides his decisions. In Africa, I have noticed something that many outsiders rarely see. Before some leaders speak about economics or military strategy, they speak about God. They do not do this as a political ritual. They say it because they believe that power is not something a man truly owns. They believe it is something temporarily entrusted to him, and that belief shapes how they see responsibility. I remember listening to the words of Nelson Mandela many years ago. Mandela once said that our choices should reflect our hopes, not our fears, and that God should guide our path. Mandela understood something profound. He understood that leadership without moral direction can easily become dangerous. Across Africa, that idea is not unusual. Many leaders speak openly about faith, morality, and accountability before God. For them, leadership is not simply management, it is a moral responsibility. But when I began observing leaders from Western countries, I noticed a different tone. Their speeches often focused on systems, on institutions, on strategy, data, and technological power. Many Western leaders believe deeply in the strength of human intelligence and the structures created by modern societies. They trust that with the right policies, the right technology, and the right economic power, human beings can shape almost any outcome. This difference is not merely personal style. It reflects something deeper. According to research by the Pew Research Center, in many African countries, more than 85% of people say religion plays a very important role in their daily lives. In parts of Western Europe, that number falls to somewhere between 20 and 30%. Culture shapes belief, and belief shapes leadership. The longer I observed these differences, the more a question began to grow in my mind. What truly separates the philosophy of leadership in Africa from the philosophy of leadership in the West? At first, I thought the answer would be simple. But the more conversations I had, the more meetings I attended, and the more history I studied, the more I realized that the answer is layered and complex. Yet there are patterns, clear patterns that appear again and again, patterns that reveal themselves through attitudes toward faith, toward humility, toward community, toward responsibility, and toward power itself. Over time, I began to recognize that these differences could be seen through several distinct lenses. 9, to be exact. 9 aspects that reveal how two different civilizations often approach the same question. What does it truly mean to lead? And why do leaders in different parts of the world sometimes walk such different paths, even when they claim to pursue the same goals? In the next part of this story, I want to begin with the first and perhaps most foundational difference of all: faith. Why so many African leaders believe faith must stand at the center of leadership, and why in many Western societies, leadership has gradually moved away from that idea. When I began meeting leaders across Africa, one pattern appeared so consistently that I could no longer ignore it. Before discussions about economics, before conversations about military alliances, before negotiations about trade or development, many of them spoke about God, not as ceremony, not as a political tool, but as something deeply personal, something that reminded them that power is temporary. In many African cultures, leadership begins with a spiritual understanding. A leader is not only responsible to the people, he is also responsible before God. That belief changes the way a person carries authority. I remember reading the words of Nelson Mandela many years ago. Mandela once said that our choices should reflect our hopes rather than our fears, and that God should guide our path. Those words were not placed into speeches merely to sound inspiring. They reflected the spiritual framework that guided his life. Mandela led South Africa through one of the most fragile transitions in modern history. After decades of apartheid, the country stood on the edge of revenge, anger, and civil conflict. Many leaders in such moments would have chosen punishment. Mandela chose réconciliation. He often spoke about forgiveness, humility, and moral responsibility. These were not simply political strategies. They were rooted in faith. Another African leader who has spoken about this responsibility is Paul Kagame of Rwanda. Kagame has said that leadership carries a moral responsibility before God and before the people. Those words reflect a belief that authority must answer to something higher than politics. This idea is common in many African societies. In villages, in cities, and even in the highest offices of government, many people believe that leadership without moral grounding quickly becomes dangerous. Power without restraint can become corruption. Power without humility can become tyranny. Power without conscience can destroy nations. Faith, in that sense, becomes a reminder that a leader is not the ultimate authority. He is only a steward. But when I began attending meetings with leaders from many Western countries, I noticed something different. Their speeches rarely began with God. Instead, they began with systems, institutions, economic frameworks, strategic models. In Western political culture, leadership is often described through the language of governance, structures, and policy design. This approach has its own strengths. Western societies have built complex institutions designed to limit power, distribute authority, and protect rights. Their systems emphasize law, checks and balances, and long-term strategic planning. Many Western leaders place their trust in the strength of these institutions. They believe that well-designed systems can guide society even when individual leaders fail. In many ways, this belief has shaped the political culture of the West for centuries. The idea of separating religion from political authority became deeply rooted in Western democracies. In the United States, for example, the principle of separating church and state has existed for more than 200 years. That separation was designed to prevent religious institutions from dominating political life. But it also created a culture where political leadership rarely speaks openly about faith in the same way that African leaders often do. When Western leaders address their citizens, they frequently emphasize rational planning, technological progress, and the strength of democratic institutions. The language of faith is often replaced by the language of policy. This does not mean Western leaders lack personal beliefs. Many of them do have deep religious convictions. But the public expression of leadership tends to focus on institutional power rather than spiritual guidance. This difference creates two distinct philosophies. In many African contexts, leadership is seen as a calling. In many Western contexts, leadership is seen as a function of systems. One approach begins with moral responsibility before God. The other begins with institutional responsibility before the law. Neither system is completely right or completely wrong. Each emerged from the history, culture, and struggles of its society. But the difference becomes visible when crises appear. When nations face moments of uncertainty, the questions leaders ask themselves often reveal what truly guides them. Some ask, what does our strategy say? Others ask, what does our conscience say? And some ask quietly in prayer, what would God have us do? For many African leaders, that final question is not unusual. It is expected, because leadership in their understanding is not only about governing people, it is about answering to something far greater than power. This is why faith remains the first and perhaps the most fundamental difference in how leadership is understood in many parts of Africa compared to much of the Western world. Faith reminds leaders that power is temporary. Faith reminds leaders that authority can corrupt. And faith reminds leaders that one day every decision will be judged not only by history but by God. Yet faith alone does not define leadership. Another equally important quality shapes the way many African leaders understand their role: humility. The understanding that authority should never be confused with personal greatness. And in the next part of this story, I want to explore that second difference. Why humility before power has long been considered a necessary quality of leadership in many African traditions, and why the concept of leadership confidence has taken a very different form in much of the Western world. After observing how faith shapes leadership across many African nations, another pattern gradually revealed itself to me. It was not written in official documents. It was not always spoken loudly in speeches, but it appeared again and again in the words of leaders who carried great responsibility: humility. In many African traditions, power is not meant to elevate a person above others. Instead, it is meant to place a heavier burden on the one who holds it. A leader is expected to remember where he came from. He is expected to remember the people who trusted him, and he is expected to remember that the position he holds today may disappear tomorrow. This mindset has deep roots in African history. Long before modern states existed, leadership in many African societies was connected to service. Chiefs, elders, and community leaders were often seen as custodians rather than rulers. Their authority came from the trust of the community. If that trust disappeared, their power disappeared as well. That cultural memory still influences how many African leaders speak about their role today. One of the clearest examples can be seen in the words of Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana. Nkrumah once said that the independence of Ghana would be meaningless unless it was connected to the liberation of the entire African continent. Those words revealed something powerful. Nkrumah did not see leadership as personal glory. He saw it as a responsibility that extended far beyond himself. He believed that the purpose of power was to serve something larger than one nation and certainly larger than one individual. In that philosophy, leadership becomes almost a form of duty. The leader does not stand at the center of history. The people do. When a leader sees himself as merely one actor within a larger struggle, humility naturally follows. But when I began observing political culture in many Western countries, I noticed a different tone. Confidence. Strong confidence in their systems, their values, and their political models. This confidence has historical reasons. Western countries experienced centuries of political evolution that produced powerful institutions, advanced economies, and influential global alliances. Because of that history, many Western leaders believe strongly in the effectiveness of the models developed within their societies. Former British Prime Minister Tony Blair once expressed this idea clearly when he said that the values of Western democracies are universal. From his perspective, the principles developed within Western political systems could be applied broadly across the world. This belief reflects a certain confidence in the strength of those institutions. Confidence itself is not a negative quality. In fact, leadership often requires it. A leader who doubts every decision will struggle to guide a nation through difficult moments. But confidence and humility are very different forces. Confidence says, our system works. Humility says, our system may work, but we must always remain cautious. Confidence looks outward and believes solutions can be exported. Humility looks inward and asks whether a leader has the wisdom to use power responsibly. In many African traditions, humility acts as a form of protection. It protects leaders from believing that their authority makes them superior. It reminds them that leadership is temporary, and it reminds them that every decision will affect millions of lives. When humility disappears, leadership can become dangerous. History offers many examples of leaders who began their careers believing they were serving their people, only to later believe they themselves had become indispensable. The moment a leader begins to believe he cannot be replaced, the path toward arrogance begins. Humility interrupts that path. It reminds leaders that no person stands above the nation, and certainly no person stands above moral responsibility. African societies, shaped by long traditions of communal life, often encourage leaders to remain close to ordinary people. Leaders are expected to listen. They are expected to show respect for elders. They are expected to remember that authority is a trust given by the community. This cultural expectation places pressure on leaders to maintain humility even when they hold great power. But in many Western political cultures, leadership often emphasizes decisiveness and strong personal authority. Political debates frequently reward leaders who appear confident, assertive, and certain of their vision. Public perception often celebrates leaders who project strength and clarity. This style can create the impression that leadership requires absolute confidence. Yet confidence without humility can sometimes blind leaders to the limits of their own understanding. Humility, on the other hand, encourages listening. It encourages, and it reminds leaders that wisdom often comes from unexpected places, from elders, from communities, from people who may never appear in official meetings. Over time, I have come to believe that humility is one of the most underrated qualities in leadership. It rarely appears in headlines. It does not attract attention in dramatic speeches, but it quietly shapes the decisions leaders make when no one else is watching. Humility reminds a leader that power is not proof of superiority. It is simply proof of responsibility. And perhaps that is why humility has remained a central expectation of leadership in many African traditions, because those traditions understand something simple but profound. A leader who forgets humility will eventually forget the people he was meant to serve. Yet humility alone does not explain the full difference between leadership cultures. There is another powerful influence that shapes how leaders make decisions. Religion itself. Not just faith as personal belief, but religion as a guiding force in political life. In the next part of this story, I want to explore how religion influences leadership decisions across many African nations, and why political systems in much of the Western world have chosen to separate religion from governance. As I continued to observe leadership across different regions of the world, another difference slowly became clear to me. It was not simply about personal belief. It was about how belief influences decisions. In many African societies, religion is not something that exists only on Sunday mornings or inside places of worship. It is woven into everyday life. It shapes how families raise children. It shapes how communities resolve conflicts, and it often shapes how leaders think about responsibility. Because of this, political leadership in many African nations often carries a visible spiritual dimension. Leaders do not hesitate to speak about prayer. They do not hesitate to acknowledge moral accountability before God. And they do not hesitate to remind their people that leadership requires ethical guidance. This expectation does not come only from leaders themselves. It comes from the people. Surveys conducted by organizations such as Afrobarometer show that in many African countries, more than 70% of citizens believe that leaders should possess strong religious faith. For many citizens, faith is seen as a safeguard. It is a reminder that a leader should answer to something greater than ambition. If a leader believes he will one day answer before God, then perhaps he will think more carefully before abusing power. This belief has influenced many African political figures throughout history. One example is Julius Nyerere, the first president of Tanzania. Nyerere was known not only as a political leader, but also as a man deeply shaped by his Catholic faith. He once said that without faith and morality, power becomes corruption. Those words captured a concern shared by many African thinkers. Power itself is not evil, but power without moral restraint can easily become destructive. For leaders like Nyerere, faith acted as a compass. It reminded him that policies and strategies must always serve human dignity. Religion also provides language for forgiveness and reconciliation. Many African societies have experienced periods of conflict, civil war, and political struggle. In those moments, faith traditions have often played a role in rebuilding trust. Church leaders, community elders, and spiritual teachers frequently become mediators during national crises. Their presence reminds political leaders that political victory should never destroy the social fabric of the nation. Because of this history, religion remains closely connected to political culture in many African countries. But when we turn our attention to Western political systems, we see a very different historical path. Centuries ago, Europe experienced violent conflicts connected to religion. Wars between Catholic and Protestant powers devastated entire regions. These conflicts left deep scars on the political memory of Western societies. Over time, Western thinkers began to argue that separating religious institutions from political authority might reduce these conflicts. The idea gradually evolved into a principle that became central to many Western democracies: the separation of church and state. In the United States, this principle became part of the constitutional framework more than 2 centuries ago. The goal was to protect religious freedom by ensuring that government would not favor one religion over another. But the effect of this principle was broader. It gradually created a political culture in which religion and governance often operate in separate spheres. Political decisions are expected to be justified through law, policy analysis, and public reasoning rather than religious doctrine. This does not mean that religion disappeared from Western societies. Many citizens still hold strong religious beliefs. Many Western leaders privately pray and attend religious services, but the public language of politics tends to emphasize secular reasoning. Policy debates revolve around economic projections, legal interpretations, and scientific evidence. Religious arguments are rarely presented as the primary justification for national policy. This difference creates a striking contrast with many African political traditions. In Africa, leaders may openly ask for prayers during difficult national moments. They may reference scripture when speaking about justice or forgiveness. They may publicly acknowledge that divine guidance plays a role in their decisions. In Western political culture, leaders more often emphasize the role of expert advisors, research institutions, and policy think tanks. Governments invest heavily in analytical organizations that study economic trends, security threats, and technological change. In the United States alone, billions of dollars are spent each year on research groups designed to help guide political decision-making. These institutions analyze data, produce policy models, and provide strategic recommendations. The Western model places great trust in the power of human knowledge. The African tradition often places greater trust in the combination of human wisdom and spiritual guidance. Again, this difference does not mean that one approach is entirely right and the other entirely wrong. Human societies are complex. Every culture develops systems that reflect its history, its struggles, and its values. Western societies built political systems designed to prevent religious domination of government. African societies maintain traditions in which faith and leadership remain deeply connected. But the difference is still visible. In Africa, faith often stands beside power. In much of the West, faith stands apart from power. And this distinction quietly shapes how leaders approach some of the most difficult decisions they will ever face. When a nation stands at a crossroads, what voice does a leader listen to? The voice of data, the voice of advisors, or the quiet voice of conscience that many people associate with faith. For many African leaders, those voices are not separate. They are intertwined, but understanding leadership requires looking beyond faith and religion alone. Another important difference lies in how leaders themselves define power. Is power something to hold, or something to serve through? In the next part of this story, I want to explore how different cultures understand the meaning of power itself, and why in many African traditions, leadership is often described not as authority but as service. As my journey through international meetings and diplomatic conversations continued, I began to notice another difference that shaped leadership more deeply than most people realize. It was not about faith. It was not about humility. It was about the meaning of power itself. In many African traditions, power is rarely described as possession. It is described as responsibility. This may sound like a small difference in language, but it changes everything. If a leader believes power belongs to him, he may protect it at all costs. If a leader believes power has been entrusted to him, he understands that one day he must give it back. That difference affects how decisions are made. Across Africa, the idea that leadership equals service has been repeated by many of the continent's most respected voices. One of the most powerful statements about this idea came from Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Tutu once said that leadership is not about prestige, power, or status. It is about responsibility. Those words were spoken by a man who helped guide South Africa through one of the most difficult moral transitions in modern history. During the period after apartheid, the nation faced the danger of deep revenge and social division. Many people carried wounds that could easily have turned into anger. But leaders like Desmond Tutu believed that leadership required something more than authority. It required moral courage. Through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, South Africa attempted something that many countries had never tried before. Instead of focusing only on punishment, the nation attempted to confront its past through truth and accountability. That process was not perfect, but it reflected a philosophy that leadership must serve healing rather than domination. This idea of service appears in many African cultural traditions. A leader is often expected to carry the concerns of the community. In village life, elders and chiefs do not rule in isolation. They listen to counsels. They consider the wisdom of older generations. They try to maintain harmony within the community. Leadership in this context becomes less about commanding people and more about guiding them. The leader becomes a caretaker of balance. This philosophy continues to influence how many African leaders describe their role today. They speak about serving the nation, serving the people, serving the future. Power becomes a tool for protecting the community. But when I looked at many Western political systems, I noticed that power is often described differently. Not necessarily as domination, but as authority within a competitive system. Modern Western politics operates through elections, political parties, policy agendas, and international alliances. In this environment, leaders often compete intensely to implement their programs. Success is measured through policy achievements, economic growth, and geopolitical influence. Western political leaders frequently speak about advancing national interests. They focus on strengthening their country's economy, military capability, and global position. This approach has produced powerful alliances and institutions. Organizations such as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and large economic blocs were created through strategic thinking about power and security. In this framework, power is often viewed as the ability to shape events, the ability to influence international decisions, the ability to protect national interests in a complex global system. This is not necessarily selfish. Every nation has the right to protect its people and pursue prosperity. But the language surrounding power in Western politics often emphasizes influence and capability. In African traditions, the language surrounding power often emphasizes duty and care. These two perspectives can lead to different priorities. If leadership is seen primarily as influence, then strategic advantage becomes the main objective. If leadership is seen primarily as service, then the well-being of the community becomes the guiding principle. In reality, most leaders attempt to balance both responsibilities. A nation must protect its interests, but it must also protect its people. Yet the cultural understanding of power still shapes how leaders think about their role. In some traditions, the leader stands at the center. In others, the leader stands among the people. African philosophy often reminds leaders that power should never separate them from the lives of ordinary citizens. A leader must remain connected to the struggles of farmers, workers, teachers, and families. If that connection disappears, leadership becomes distant and fragile. That is why many African traditions emphasize accessibility. Leaders are expected to listen. They are expected to walk among their people. They are expected to remember the conditions from which they came. This expectation reinforces the belief that leadership is not about personal elevation. It is about collective responsibility. The leader is not the owner of power. He is the guardian of trust. And trust, once broken, is very difficult to restore. When leaders forget that truth, power becomes a shield rather than a tool. It begins to protect the leader instead of the nation. History has shown again and again what happens when power becomes disconnected from service. Institutions weaken, public trust disappears, and nations begin to fracture. But when leadership remains grounded in service, power becomes something very different. It becomes a bridge between authority and responsibility. It becomes a commitment to the people, rather than a reward for the leader. This philosophy of service is closely connected to another powerful idea found throughout African culture. An idea that speaks about community, about belonging, about the understanding that human beings exist not as isolated individuals, but as part of a larger human family. This idea is captured in a single word that many people outside Africa have only recently begun to hear: Ubuntu. And in the next part of this story, I want to explore how the philosophy of Ubuntu shapes leadership across many African societies, and why the Western world often emphasizes a very different concept: individualism. As I continued reflecting on the differences I had observed between leadership traditions, I realized that one of the most profound differences lies in how societies understand the relationship between the individual and the community. This difference shapes leadership in ways that many people rarely notice. Across much of Africa, a simple philosophy has guided social life for generations. It is known by a single word: Ubuntu. The word is difficult to translate directly into English, but its meaning is powerful and clear. It is often expressed through a simple idea: I am because we are. This idea suggests that a human being does not exist alone. Our identity, our dignity, and our well-being are tied to the people around us. We become who we are through relationships, through family, through neighbors, through the wider community. Many African leaders have spoken about this philosophy over the years. Nelson Mandela often referred to Ubuntu when speaking about reconciliation and social harmony. Desmond Tutu also explained that Ubuntu teaches us that our humanity is bound together. According to this philosophy, a person cannot truly succeed while the community suffers. If the community is wounded, every individual carries part of that wound. If the community flourishes, everyone shares in its strength. When leadership emerges from this worldview, it naturally focuses on collective well-being. A leader does not simply ask what benefits one group or one political faction. He asks what strengthens the entire community. In African village traditions, decisions are often discussed collectively. Elders gather. Families speak. Different voices are heard before a conclusion is reached. This process can sometimes appear slower than highly centralized decision-making, but it reinforces something important. People feel included. They feel that leadership listens. They feel that their lives matter in the decisions being made. Ubuntu also shapes how leaders approach conflict. If two individuals fight, the community seeks reconciliation rather than permanent division. The goal is not simply to declare a winner. The goal is to restore harmony. That approach has influenced many African efforts at national reconciliation after periods of conflict. Leaders often speak about healing the nation rather than defeating opponents. They recognize that societies cannot thrive when divisions remain unresolved. But when I began studying leadership cultures in many Western societies, I encountered a very different philosophical foundation. Individualism. In Western political thought, the individual often stands at the center of social and political life. Personal freedom, personal rights, and personal achievement are emphasized strongly. These ideas have deep historical roots. During the Enlightenment period, Western thinkers began to argue that individuals should possess certain rights that governments could not take away. This concept helped shape modern democratic systems. Documents such as the Declaration of Independence and other foundational texts emphasized individual liberty as a central political value. Over time, Western societies developed strong cultures of personal independence. People are encouraged to pursue their own goals, to express their individual opinions, to define their own identity. This emphasis on individual rights has produced many positive developments. It has strengthened protections for personal freedom. It has encouraged innovation and creativity. It has allowed individuals to challenge authority and demand justice. But it also shapes leadership differently. When societies prioritize individual achievement, leaders often emphasize personal vision and personal leadership style. Political campaigns often highlight the strength, determination, and capability of the individual leader. Public attention frequently focuses on the personality of the leader rather than the collective wisdom of the community. This creates a political environment where leadership can sometimes appear more individual-centered. Leaders present their ideas, voters evaluate their plans. The individual leader becomes the central figure in national decision-making. In contrast, the philosophy of Ubuntu encourages leaders to see themselves as part of a broader human network. The leader is not the sole architect of the nation's future. He is one voice among many. He carries responsibility, but he does not carry absolute authority. When leadership embraces Ubuntu, the success of the nation is measured by the well-being of the community as a whole. Economic growth matters. Security matters. But the strength of relationships within society matters just as much. Families must feel stable. Communities must feel respected. People must believe they belong. Without that sense of belonging, even wealthy societies can become divided and fragile. Ubuntu reminds leaders that policies should strengthen human connection. That development should lift entire communities rather than only a few individuals. And that dignity belongs to every member of society. This philosophy has shaped how many African leaders speak about unity. They speak about shared destiny. They speak about collective progress. They speak about nations moving forward together. The Western emphasis on individualism and the African emphasis on community do not have to oppose each other. Both perspectives contain wisdom. Individual rights protect freedom. Community values protect solidarity. Healthy societies often need both. But the balance between these ideas influences how leadership is practiced. In some cultures, the leader stands as a visionary individual guiding the nation. In others, the leader stands as a servant within a collective journey. Ubuntu teaches leaders to remember something simple. No one truly rises alone. Every success is connected to the lives of others. Every decision affects more than the person who makes it. And when leaders forget this truth, societies begin to fracture. But when leaders embrace it, nations become stronger. Yet even when leaders are guided by faith, humility, service, and community, they still face moments when mistakes happen. No leader is perfect. Every government encounters failures. Every nation faces unexpected crises. The true test of leadership often appears in those moments. How does a leader respond when things go wrong? Does he look inward for wisdom? Does he seek guidance from faith? Or does he rely primarily on experts, data, and strategic analysis? In the next part of this story, I want to explore another difference I have observed: how leaders from different cultures respond to mistakes and uncertainty, and why the sources they turn to for guidance often reveal the deeper philosophy behind their leadership. As I continued reflecting on the leadership cultures I had observed, I realized that some of the most revealing moments in leadership do not occur during times of success. They occur during moments of failure. Every nation faces crises. Every government makes mistakes. Even the most capable leaders eventually confront situations that do not unfold as planned. The true character of leadership often appears in those moments. What does a leader do when the plan collapses? What does he turn to when certainty disappears? In many African political traditions, leaders often respond to uncertainty with reflection and prayer. Faith becomes not only a source of moral guidance, but also a source of strength when facing difficult choices. I have heard many African leaders speak about this openly. When situations become complex or painful, they ask for wisdom beyond their own understanding. They ask for patience. They ask for clarity. One example comes from Liberia's President George Weah. Weah once said that without God, leadership becomes empty. Those words reflect a belief shared by many people across the continent. Leadership carries enormous pressure. Decisions affect millions of lives. Without moral grounding, that pressure can become overwhelming. Faith offers leaders a way to step back from the immediate chaos of politics and seek deeper perspective. Prayer does not replace responsibility, but it can provide calm in moments when fear and anger might otherwise dominate decision-making. In many African societies, turning toward spiritual guidance during crisis is not seen as weakness. It is seen as humility. It is an acknowledgement that no human being possesses perfect wisdom. When leaders openly admit that they need guidance beyond themselves, they remind people that leadership is not about pride. It is about responsibility. But when I looked closely at how leadership often operates in many Western political systems, I saw a different response to crisis. Western governments frequently turn first to expert analysis. When unexpected challenges arise, teams of advisors, analysts, and specialists are assembled. Economic experts study financial data. Security analysts evaluate threats. Scientific advisors analyze possible outcomes. Entire networks of institutions exist for this purpose. Think tanks, policy institutes, and research organizations study complex problems and propose solutions. Governments invest enormous resources in these analytical systems. In the United States alone, billions of dollars are spent every year supporting organizations dedicated to policy research and strategic analysis. These institutions collect data, build models, and generate forecasts that help leaders evaluate possible decisions. This approach reflects a deep belief in the power of human knowledge. Western political culture often emphasizes evidence-based decision-making. Leaders are expected to consult experts and evaluate detailed reports before taking action. This reliance on expertise has produced remarkable achievements in many areas. Scientific research has advanced medicine. Economic analysis has shaped global financial systems. Strategic planning has helped governments respond to natural disasters and security threats. The Western model places enormous trust in human reasoning and technological capability. But even the most sophisticated models cannot predict everything. Data can reveal patterns. It can estimate probabilities. Yet, human societies remain complex and unpredictable. Unexpected events often disrupt carefully designed strategies. This is where the difference between the two leadership traditions becomes visible again. African leaders may consult advisors and experts as well, but many still combine those consultations with spiritual reflection. They believe that human knowledge alone cannot fully capture the moral dimensions of leadership decisions. Data may explain consequences, but conscience must guide choices. Western leaders often emphasize analytical clarity. African leaders often emphasize moral discernment. Both approaches seek wisdom. They simply look for it in different places. One looks primarily toward human expertise. The other looks toward both human expertise and spiritual guidance. Over time, I have come to believe that leadership requires both forms of understanding. Experts can illuminate the technical aspects of complex problems, but moral reflection helps leaders remember why those problems matter. A nation may know how to build powerful systems, but it must also ask whether those systems serve justice. It may understand how to increase economic production, but it must also ask whether that prosperity reaches ordinary families. Technical knowledge answers the question of how. Moral reflection answers the question of why. When leadership forgets the second question, power can drift away from human dignity. When leadership forgets the first question, good intentions may fail to produce practical results. Wise leadership requires balance. Yet the traditions of different cultures often emphasize one source of guidance more strongly than another. African leadership traditions often remind leaders to seek wisdom through humility and spiritual reflection. Western leadership traditions often emphasize careful analysis and expert advice. Both approaches contain valuable insights, but they reveal something deeper about how societies understand authority. Some cultures believe wisdom begins with the heart and conscience. Others believe wisdom begins with the mind and data. Perhaps the most effective leaders learn to listen to both. Yet leadership is not shaped only by how leaders respond to mistakes. It is also shaped by the broader culture that forms them long before they enter office. The traditions, education, and social expectations surrounding leaders influence how they behave once they hold power. In the next part of this story, I want to explore how leadership culture itself differs between Africa and the Western world. Why tradition and spiritual heritage remain central to leadership identity in many African societies, and why leadership culture in the West often revolves around institutions, professional training, and technological management. As I continued to observe leaders from different parts of the world, I began to understand something very important. Leaders do not emerge from empty space. They are shaped long before they enter office. Their beliefs, habits, and instincts are influenced by the culture that surrounds them while they grow up. Leadership, in many ways, is the product of the environment that forms a person's character. In many African societies, leadership is deeply connected to tradition. Long before modern political institutions existed, communities relied on systems of elders, councils, spiritual leaders, and respected figures who helped guide collective decisions. These traditions did not disappear when modern governments formed. Instead, they continued to influence how people think about authority. In many African countries today, political leaders still maintain strong connections with religious institutions and traditional cultural events. It is not unusual for presidents and ministers to attend major religious celebrations. They appear at community gatherings. They speak with traditional chiefs and spiritual leaders. These moments are not merely symbolic. They remind leaders that their authority is connected to the people and their traditions. Leadership in this context is not only political. It is cultural. It is spiritual, and it is historical. A leader must understand the beliefs of the people. He must respect their traditions. He must recognize that culture shapes the way citizens interpret justice, dignity, and responsibility. Because of this, African leadership culture often emphasizes moral identity. People expect their leaders to demonstrate values that reflect the traditions of their society: integrity, respect for elders, commitment to community, spiritual awareness. When a leader fails to embody these values, the disappointment is often deeper than political disagreement. It becomes a moral disappointment. But when I looked closely at leadership culture in many Western societies, I noticed a different pathway shaping political leaders: professional training, institutional preparation. Modern Western leadership culture often develops through structured education and specialized training programs. Universities, policy schools, and leadership institutes play an enormous role in shaping future political figures. Many Western leaders pass through programs that focus on governance, economics, international relations, and public administration. Institutions such as the Harvard Kennedy School, for example, have trained generations of public officials from around the world. These programs emphasize analytical thinking, strategic planning, management techniques. Students learn how to design policies, interpret economic data, and manage complex government systems. This type of preparation reflects a belief that leadership can be strengthened through technical knowledge. The leader becomes not only a moral figure but also a manager of institutions. Modern states are incredibly complex. They involve massive budgets, global trade relationships, security alliances, and advanced technologies. Western leadership culture often prepares individuals to navigate these systems through professional expertise. The leader becomes something like the chief executive officer of a national organization. His task is to coordinate institutions, allocate resources, and implement policies efficiently. This approach has clear advantages. Technical knowledge allows leaders to manage complex economies. Professional training helps them understand legal systems, diplomatic negotiations, and financial structures. But this model also shifts the focus of leadership. Instead of emerging primarily from community traditions, leadership becomes closely connected to institutional systems. A leader's authority is reinforced by professional credentials and policy expertise. In African traditions, leadership identity often comes from cultural legitimacy. In Western systems, leadership identity often comes from institutional legitimacy. Both forms of legitimacy matter. People want leaders who understand the culture of their nation, but they also want leaders who can manage modern systems effectively. Yet these two pathways still shape leadership differently. When leaders grow up within strong cultural traditions, they often emphasize moral character and community connection. When leaders grow up within highly institutionalized systems, they often emphasize efficiency, management, and technical capability. One model produces leaders who speak frequently about values. The other produces leaders who speak frequently about strategies. Both perspectives contain valuable insights. Values give leadership purpose. Strategy gives leadership direction. But the balance between these elements influences how leaders approach their role. In some societies, the leader is expected to embody the moral spirit of the nation. In others, the leader is expected to master the mechanisms of governance. African leadership culture often asks the leader to stand as a guardian of tradition and moral identity. Western leadership culture often asks the leader to function as a skilled administrator within powerful institutions. Neither expectation is simple. Both carry immense pressure. But these differences in formation help explain why leaders from different regions sometimes approach problems in very different ways. Culture teaches them what leadership is supposed to look like. It shapes their instincts long before they ever enter a presidential office. Yet even culture does not fully explain the differences in leadership philosophy. There is another layer beneath all of this, a deeper question about truth itself. How do leaders decide what is right and what is wrong? Do they believe their political model represents a universal truth that should guide the world? Or do they believe each nation must discover its own path? This question has influenced international politics for generations. And in the next part of this story, I want to explore how leaders from different traditions answer that question. As I reflected more deeply on the differences between leadership traditions, I began to notice something even more fundamental than culture, faith, or institutions. It was the question of truth. How do leaders determine what is right? And once they believe they have found the answer, how far should that belief extend? Should it apply only to their own nation? Or should it apply to the entire world? This question has shaped global politics for centuries. Many Western political leaders have often spoken with strong confidence about the values developed within their societies. They believe that certain political principles such as democracy, individual liberty, and constitutional governance represent universal ideals. From their perspective, these values are not limited to one culture. They believe they are suitable for all humanity. One example of this belief appeared in a speech delivered by President George W. Bush in the early years of the 21st century. In that speech, he declared that the survival of liberty within his own nation increasingly depended on the spread of liberty in other nations. This statement reflected a powerful idea. The idea that political freedom, as defined within Western democratic systems, should expand across the world. Many Western leaders genuinely believe that expanding democratic institutions strengthens global stability and human dignity. Their confidence in these principles comes from centuries of political development. Western societies experienced revolutions, constitutional reforms, and long struggles to establish democratic governance. Those experiences shaped a belief that their political models represent a path toward freedom and prosperity. Because of this belief, Western foreign policy has often included efforts to promote democratic systems internationally. Sometimes this promotion occurs through diplomacy and economic cooperation. Sometimes it occurs through political pressure. And sometimes in more controversial moments of history, it has occurred through military intervention. The underlying assumption is often the same, that certain political models represent the best framework for human societies. But when I speak with many African leaders, I often hear a different perspective. They do not necessarily reject democratic ideals, but they often emphasize something else. The idea that every nation must find its own path. Africa is an incredibly diverse continent. Different languages, different histories, different religious traditions, different colonial experiences. Because of this diversity, many African leaders believe that political systems cannot simply be copied from one region and applied directly to another. Each society carries its own social fabric. Each nation must build institutions that reflect its cultural realities. Many African thinkers argue that governance models must grow from the people themselves rather than being imported from outside. This perspective does not reject universal human dignity. It simply suggests that the path toward justice may take different forms in different societies. History has shown that political systems transplanted without cultural adaptation can struggle to function effectively. Institutions require legitimacy, and legitimacy grows from cultural trust. If people feel that their political system reflects their own values and traditions, they are more likely to support it. If they feel that it has been imposed from outside, they may resist it. This difference in perspective creates tension in global politics. Western leaders sometimes believe they are promoting freedom. African leaders sometimes feel that their sovereignty and cultural identity must be respected. Both sides often believe they are acting in good faith, but they approach the question of truth differently. One perspective sees certain political systems as universal models. The other perspective emphasizes the uniqueness of each society. This does not mean African leaders reject international cooperation. Africa participates actively in global institutions. African nations work with partners around the world in trade, diplomacy, and development. But many African leaders emphasize that cooperation should not erase cultural identity. Global progress should respect local wisdom. When nations share ideas with one another, they must also listen to one another. True partnership requires humility from all sides. Perhaps the most important lesson in this debate is that leadership must remain open to learning. No single civilization has discovered all the answers. Human societies continue to evolve. Political systems continue to adapt. History teaches us that arrogance, whether cultural or political, often leads to conflict. But humility opens the door to dialogue. When leaders recognize that different societies may approach the same questions in different ways, cooperation becomes easier. The world becomes less about imposing solutions and more about exchanging wisdom. African leadership traditions often emphasize this humility. They recognize that each community carries its own knowledge. Each culture carries its own lessons. And no nation should assume that its model alone defines the future of humanity. Yet all these differences, faith, humility, religion, power, community, decision-making, culture, and the understanding of truth, ultimately lead to one final and deeper question. What is the true purpose of leadership? Why does leadership exist at all? Is it about control? Is it about influence? Or is it about something far more profound? In the final aspect of this reflection, I want to explore the deepest difference I have observed between leadership traditions. The philosophy that defines what leadership itself truly means. After reflecting on all these differences, one final question remains. What is leadership truly for? Behind every political system, every speech, every policy, there is a deeper philosophy that defines the purpose of leadership itself. This final difference may be the most important of all. Across many African traditions, leadership is not defined by authority. It is defined by responsibility. And even more deeply, it is defined by service. A leader is not simply someone who commands others. A leader is someone who carries the burdens of others. This idea has been expressed by many of Africa's most respected moral voices. Desmond Tutu once said something that captures this philosophy clearly. He said that a leader is not someone who commands. A leader is someone who serves. Those words are simple, yet they contain a powerful truth. If leadership becomes centered on command alone, it risks becoming disconnected from the people it is meant to guide. But when leadership is built upon service, the relationship between leader and people changes. The leader becomes accountable. He becomes attentive. He becomes responsible not only for decisions, but for the human consequences of those decisions. Service-based leadership requires humility. It requires patience. It requires the ability to listen even when criticism is uncomfortable. And perhaps most importantly, it requires a constant awareness that leadership exists only because people have entrusted someone with responsibility. Without that trust, power becomes hollow. Across many African societies, this philosophy has been reinforced through generations of cultural teaching. Elders remind young people that leadership is not a privilege. It is a burden. A leader must sacrifice comfort. He must endure criticism. He must carry worries that others may never see. Leadership, in this sense, is not an elevation above others. It is a commitment to serve them. When I speak with ordinary people across Africa, I often hear the same expectation. They do not necessarily expect leaders to be perfect, but they expect them to remember the people. They expect leaders to remain connected to the struggles of everyday life, to understand the realities of farmers, workers, families, and communities. When leaders forget those realities, they lose the moral foundation of their authority. But when I observe leadership philosophy in many Western political systems, I often notice a different emphasis. Leadership is frequently described through the language of power and institutional control. A leader must manage large bureaucracies, coordinate complex international alliances, implement strategic policies that influence global economics and security. In this environment, leadership often resembles executive management. The leader becomes the head of a powerful institutional machine. He must direct agencies, negotiate with foreign governments, oversee budgets, and implement national strategies. Success is often measured through performance indicators: economic growth, military strength, technological innovation, global influence. These are important measures. Nations must protect their citizens. They must build strong economies. They must navigate a complicated international landscape. But when leadership becomes defined primarily through institutional power, something subtle can happen. The human dimension may begin to fade. Policies can become numbers. Strategies can become diagrams. Decisions can become calculations. And sometimes the voices of ordinary people can become distant within large systems. This is why many African traditions continue to emphasize service as the heart of leadership. Service keeps leadership connected to humanity. It reminds leaders that every policy affects real lives. Every economic decision touches families. Every security decision touches communities. Leadership cannot be reduced to strategy alone. It must remain rooted in compassion. Faith, humility, community, and service are not merely cultural traditions. They are safeguards. They protect leadership from becoming detached from human dignity. They remind leaders that their authority is temporary, and that their true legacy will not be measured only by the power they held. It will be measured by the people they served. History remembers many powerful rulers, but it remembers servant leaders differently, because servant leaders do not seek to dominate history. They seek to improve the lives of those around them, and when they succeed, their influence lasts far beyond their time in office. Perhaps the greatest challenge for leadership in the modern world is finding balance. Nations need strong institutions. They need economic development. They need security and technological progress. But they also need moral direction. They need leaders who remember that power without compassion can become dangerous, and that authority without service can lose its purpose. The differences between leadership traditions in Africa and the West reveal two different philosophies. One emphasizes systems and institutional strength. The other emphasizes moral responsibility and service to the community. Both perspectives offer valuable lessons. But perhaps the future of leadership will depend on combining their strengths: strategic intelligence guided by moral conscience, institutional power balanced by humility, technological progress guided by compassion. If leaders can achieve that balance, perhaps the world will move closer to the kind of leadership humanity truly needs. Leadership that does not divide nations. Leadership that does not seek domination. Leadership that serves humanity itself. And this reflection leads naturally to the final part of my message. A message not about differences between continents, but about the future of the world we all share. After reflecting on all these differences, I want to speak not only as a president, I want to speak as a human being who has watched the world change. I have observed leaders in conference rooms filled with bright lights and careful diplomacy. I have listened to speeches about strategy, economics, and global influence. But I have also walked through villages where people worry about simple things. Food for their children, peace in their communities, hope for the next generation. Those two worlds often feel very far apart. Yet leadership exists precisely to connect them. The true test of leadership is not how impressive a speech may sound. It is whether ordinary people feel that their lives are becoming more hopeful. Across Africa, across America, across Europe, across Asia, the desires of ordinary people are surprisingly similar. People want peace. They want dignity. They want the ability to raise their families without fear. They want leaders who remember that power should protect life, not endanger it. But sometimes the world forgets these simple truths. Sometimes nations compete so intensely that they forget their shared humanity. Sometimes political arguments become louder than moral reflection. And sometimes leaders begin to believe that power itself is the ultimate goal. When that happens, societies can begin to drift away from the values that once held them together. That is why conversations about leadership matter. Not only for presidents or ministers, but for everyone. Because leadership is not limited to government offices. Parents lead families. Teachers lead classrooms. Pastors lead congregations. Community elders guide younger generations. Leadership appears wherever someone carries responsibility for others. And in all those places, the same question appears again and again. What kind of leadership will guide our future? Will it be leadership driven only by competition and power? Or will it be leadership guided by conscience and service? Throughout history, the teachings of faith have often reminded humanity that power must remain humble. For those who believe in God, leadership is never merely political. It is moral. It carries spiritual responsibility. Many people in the United States understand this deeply. The history of American civil rights movements, for example, shows how faith leaders helped guide the nation toward justice. Churches became places where courage was nurtured. Pastors became voices for dignity. Faith reminded people that leadership should defend human worth. That same moral voice can still guide the world today, regardless of nationality, regardless of race, regardless of culture, because the core message remains the same. Human dignity matters. Leadership must serve life, and power must never forget compassion. Africa continues to grow and change. New generations are rising with new ideas and ambitions. The continent faces challenges, but it also carries extraordinary potential. Its young population, its cultures, and its resilience offer hope for the future. But Africa's future will not depend only on Africa. The world is deeply interconnected. What happens in one region influences every other region. The prosperity of one nation can strengthen others. The suffering of one nation can echo across continents. For this reason, global leadership must move beyond rivalry. It must move toward cooperation. No nation holds all wisdom. No culture holds every answer. When nations listen to one another with humility, the world becomes safer. When leaders seek understanding rather than dominance, peace becomes more possible. I believe deeply that humanity still has the ability to choose a better path. A path guided by moral responsibility. A path guided by respect. A path guided by the understanding that our shared future matters more than temporary victories. But that path requires courage. It requires leaders who are willing to place conscience above ambition. It requires citizens who demand integrity from those who hold power. And it requires individuals everywhere to reject hatred and division. Every generation receives a choice: to repeat the mistakes of the past, or to build something wiser for the future. My hope is that the world will choose wisdom, that nations will choose cooperation over confrontation, that leaders will remember that their authority exists only to serve the people, and that humanity will remember that every life carries dignity. If these reflections have spoken to your heart, I invite you to continue these conversations. Share your thoughts. Speak with others about the kind of leadership our world needs. And if these reflections have encouraged you, continue listening to voices that seek understanding and hope. because meaningful conversations are one of the ways we move closer to a better world. And before I close this message, I want to leave you with a simple affirmation, not as a declaration of power, but as a statement of responsibility. I speak these words as a man who carries the trust of his nation, and as someone who believes that truth must always guide leadership. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and what I have shared with you comes from conviction and honesty. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and these reflections come from what I believe to be true. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and these words are spoken with sincerity and responsibility.